Andes Flight 571 survivors. In October 1972, a Uruguayan Air Force Fairchild FH-227D, carrying 45 passengers and crew, mostly members of the Old Christians Rugby Club, along with their families and friends, crashed into a remote ridge in the Andes Mountains at an altitude of 11,800 feet. The impact tore off both wings in the tail section, leaving the fuselage to slide down a glacier. 12 people died in the crash, or within the first few hours. The survivors, many with severe injuries, found themselves in one of the most inhospitable environments on Earth. Daytime temperatures barely rose above freezing, and nights dropped to -30 degrees Fahrenheit. They had no mountaineering equipment, no cold weather clothing beyond light jackets, and only small amounts of chocolate, wine, and a few cans of food scavenged from the wreckage. For the first week, they huddled inside the fuselage, listening to a transistor radio for news of rescue efforts. When they heard that the search had been called off after 8 days, they realized no one was coming. The psychological toll was immense. The certainty of death became something they had to confront directly. Their first major decision was about food. The bodies of those who died were preserved in the snow, and after days of starvation, the group made a collective, agonizing decision to consume them. Survivors later described this as the most difficult moment of their ordeal, but also the moment that gave them the strength to keep going. On day 17, an avalanche buried the fuselage, killing 8 more survivors. Those left alive spent 3 days digging themselves out with their bare hands. After that, leadership emerged. Fernando Parado, Roberto Canessa, and others began planning an escape. They believed that rescue would never come and that walking out was the only option. They constructed sleeping bags from insulation and a makeshift tent from nylon. After 2 failed attempts, a group of 3, Parado, Canessa, and a third survivor, set out on December 12, 1972, 61 days after the crash. They walked for 10 days across the Andes, climbing peaks over 15,000 feet, with no ropes, no crampons, and only shoes made from seat cushions. Parado later said that his motivation was the promise he made to his dying father before leaving for the trip, that he would return. When they finally encountered a Chilean horseman on the far side of the mountains, they had walked 38 miles through impossible terrain. Helicopters rescued the remaining survivors the next day. All 16 were brought to safety after 72 days. The story became a landmark case in survival psychology, illustrating how collective decision-making, adaptive thinking, and the refusal to accept death can overcome conditions that seem unsurvivable. In the decades after, survivors spoke publicly about the moral weight of their choices, but every one of them emphasized that the group's commitment to each other, the rule that no one would eat alone, that decisions were made unanimously, that they would all walk out together or none, was what made their survival possible. Juliane Koepcke. On December 24, 1971, Lanza Flight 508 was a Lockheed L-188 Electra flying from Lima to Pucallpa, Peru, carrying 92 passengers and crew. 17-year-old Juliane Koepcke was traveling with her mother, a prominent ornithologist, to join her father at a research station in the Amazon. Flying through a severe thunderstorm, the plane was struck by lightning at approximately 21,000 feet. Juliane later described seeing a bright flash, then the plane disintegrating around her. She fell, still strapped to her seat, into the dense canopy of the Peruvian rainforest. She remained conscious during the fall, later estimating that she was falling for about 2 minutes before the trees broke her descent. She woke the next morning, alone. Her collarbone was broken, she had a deep gash on her arm, and one eye was swollen shut. Her seatbelt had loosened during the fall, allowing her to free herself. She had no food, no equipment, no shoes. Her sandals had been lost in the fall. She did have one critical piece of knowledge. Her father had taught her that following water leads to civilization. For the next 11 days, she walked, waded, and swam through the jungle. She moved downstream through flooded creeks and rivers, often waist-deep in water infested with piranhas and crocodiles. She drank from streams and ate whatever she could find, fruit from fallen trees, insects, and eventually maggots she extracted from a rotting piece of meat she found. On the 10th day, she found a boat tied to a tree. Remembering her father's instruction that gasoline can be used to treat wounds, she found a can, poured it into her infected arm, and removed 35 maggots from the open wound. The next morning, she heard voices and found a small shelter where loggers stored supplies. A logger returned later that day and took her to the nearest town. She was the sole survivor of 92 passengers. Her survival was later studied for its remarkable combination of knowledge. Her parents had both taught her survival skills and psychological endurance. She never panicked, never stopped moving, and maintained a singular focus on finding water and following it. In interviews decades later, she described her mindset as purely practical. "I knew that if I stopped, I would die, so I did not stop." She later became a mammologist, dedicating her career to the Amazon rainforest, the place that nearly claimed her life. Chesley Sully Sullenberger and U.S. Airways Flight 1549. On January 15, 2009, U.S. Airways Flight 1549, an Airbus A320, departed LaGuardia Airport in New York, bound for Charlotte, North Carolina. At 3:27 p.m., 90 seconds after takeoff, and at an altitude of 2,800 feet, the aircraft struck a flock of Canada geese. Both engines lost thrust almost simultaneously. The event is known in aviation as a dual-engine flameout, an occurrence so rare that few pilots had ever trained for it, and none had experienced it in actual flight. Captain Chesley Sullenberger, 58, a former Air Force fighter pilot with decades of experience, took control. He had approximately 200 seconds to assess the situation before the aircraft would lose all energy and stall. Air traffic controllers offered two options: a return to LaGuardia or a diversion to Teterboro Airport in New Jersey. Sully evaluated both in seconds and determined neither was possible. The plane was too low, too slow, and losing altitude too quickly. In what he later called a calculated risk, he announced, "We're going to be in the Hudson." First Officer Jeff Skiles worked the checklists while Sully flew. The landing was executed without engines, meaning no thrust, no flaps, and no power for most hydraulic systems. Sully brought the plane down at 3:31 p.m., striking the water at 130 knots with the nose slightly raised. The impact was survivable but violent. Ferries and rescue boats arrived within minutes. All 155 people on board survived. The psychological dimensions of this survival story are distinct. Sully later described his state during the event as calm with extreme focus. He reported no fear during the 200 seconds, only a narrowing of attention to the problem in front of him. Post-event analysis showed he had made decisions that were mathematically optimal. His landing point was within seconds of the best possible outcome given the aircraft's energy state. But beyond technical skill, the survival of everyone on board depended on the behavior of the passengers. Evacuation footage showed people leaving their belongings behind, helping each other onto the wings, and waiting for rescue boats without panicking. Sully credited this collective calm. "The passengers were heroic," he said later. "They followed instructions, they helped each other, and they did not give up." The event became a case study in how leadership, training, and group cooperation can turn a catastrophe into a survival story. Vesna Vulović. On January 26, 1972, JAT Flight 367, a McDonnell Douglas DC-9, was flying from Stockholm to Belgrade with a stop in Copenhagen. At 4:01 p.m., over the town of Srbska Kamenice in Czechoslovakia, a bomb concealed in the cargo hold detonated. The explosion tore the aircraft apart at 33,330 feet, approximately 10,000 meters or 6.3 miles. The plane broke into several pieces. All 28 passengers and crew members were killed, except one, flight attendant Vesna Vulović, 22 years old. Vesna fell inside the tail section of the aircraft, which remained relatively intact as it descended. She was pinned against a food cart, and investigators later theorized that the fuselage section's shape created enough air resistance to slow her fall. The section landed on a snow-covered wooded slope, which further cushioned the impact. She was found 3 days later by a local man who heard her crying from within the wreckage. She was severely injured, a fractured skull, 2 crushed vertebrae that left her temporarily paralyzed from the waist down, 3 broken ribs, and a fractured pelvis. She was in a coma for 27 days. Her survival entered the Guinness World Records as the highest fall survived without a parachute. Doctors were mystified. The prevailing theory was that Vesna lost consciousness almost immediately after the explosion due to a rapid drop in blood pressure, a condition known to occur when the body is exposed to sudden depressurization at high altitude. Losing consciousness, they believed, prevented her from tensing her muscles in anticipation of impact, which can actually worsen injuries. Her low blood pressure may also have allowed her heart to survive the sudden pressure change without rupturing. Vesna recovered from her paralysis and returned to work for the airline in a ground role. She never remembered the fall, nor did she remember anything after boarding the plane. In interviews, she often said, "The only thing I remember is the passenger who was sitting next to me. He was reading a newspaper. I don't remember anything after that." Her survival became a touchstone for understanding how the body can survive extreme forces when conditions align, and how the mind can protect itself by erasing the most traumatic moments entirely.